A broken man sits alone on a quiet farm outside Florence. He has been tortured, exiled, stripped of power, and forgotten by the rulers he once served. But in that silence, he writes one small book, a book that will teach kings, dictators, presidents, and CEOs how power really works. His name is Niccolò Machiavelli, and 500 years later, the world is still secretly using his playbook. He never commanded an army. He never ruled a kingdom. He never held real power for more than a few years of his entire life. And yet, his name became a word all on its own, Machiavellian, a word used to describe cunning, ruthless, calculated power, even by people who have never read a single page he wrote. Welcome to Economy Rewind History. This is the mind, the fall, and the empire of ideas built by Niccolò Machiavelli. To understand why Machiavelli's ideas hit like a thunderbolt when they were finally published, you first have to understand his world. Florence, in the late 1400s, was not a peaceful place. It was a wealthy, glittering city of bankers, artists, and merchants. It was home to the Medici family. Their fortune came from banking, and their influence quietly shaped politics, art, and religion across the entire region. But behind the beauty of the Renaissance, there was something much darker. Behind the paintings, the cathedrals, and the poetry, Italy was a brutal, fractured battlefield of constantly shifting alliances, betrayals, and assassinations. Unlike England, France, or Spain, Italy in this era was not a unified country. It was a patchwork of competing city-states: Florence, Venice, Milan, Rome, Naples. Each one was a separate power, and each one was constantly scheming against the others. They formed alliances one year and stabbed each other in the back the next. Foreign armies from France and Spain marched through Italian soil almost at will. They treated the peninsula as a chessboard for their own ambitions. This was the actual world Machiavelli grew up watching, a world where moral, idealistic rulers were frequently crushed, betrayed, or assassinated, while ruthless, cunning operators, however cruel, often survived and thrived. Machiavelli did not invent ruthlessness. He simply became the first person willing to write down, in plain language, exactly how it worked. Machiavelli was born in 1469. His family was respected, but not wealthy, and that detail mattered enormously in a city obsessed with status and money. His father was a lawyer with a modest income, but he also owned an enormous personal library. Young Niccolò grew up surrounded by classical Roman and Greek texts. He absorbed the history of empires, generals, and republics, long before he ever stepped inside a government building himself. In 1498, at the age of 29, Machiavelli was appointed to a significant government position. He became a senior diplomat and administrator for the Florentine Republic. For the next 14 years, Machiavelli did not merely study power from a library chair, he lived inside it directly. He traveled on official diplomatic missions. He met with kings, popes, and warlords. He watched up close exactly how power was won, how it was held, and how it was lost, not in philosophy books, but in negotiating rooms, war camps, and royal courts across Europe. During these years, one figure fascinated Machiavelli more than any other: Cesare Borgia, the ruthless, calculating son of Pope Alexander VI. Borgia carved out his own private territory in central Italy. He did it through military force, political manipulation, and outright betrayal. Machiavelli watched Borgia operate up close during several diplomatic missions. He observed how Borgia crushed rival factions, how he eliminated threats before they could organize against him, and how he projected an image of terrifying, controlled strength, even while making calculated private compromises behind the scenes. In one particularly chilling episode, Borgia used a brutal lieutenant to pacify a rebellious region. The lieutenant was feared, and his methods were violent. But once those brutal methods had served their purpose, Borgia turned on him. He had the man publicly executed and displayed in the town square. With one decision, Borgia eliminated a potential rival. He appeased the terrified local population and demonstrated his absolute authority over life and death, all at the same time. Machiavelli did not necessarily admire Borgia as a good man. He admired him as a terrifyingly effective one. And that distinction would become the central idea of Machiavelli's life work: the difference between goodness and effectiveness, between how rulers should behave according to religious morality, and how rulers actually needed to behave in order to survive. Everything changed for Machiavelli in 1512. The powerful Medici family returned to power in Florence. They had previously been exiled, but now they came back with foreign military backing, and they dismantled the Florentine Republic, the same republic Machiavelli had spent 14 years faithfully serving. Machiavelli was immediately stripped of his position. And worse, he was soon accused of conspiring against the newly restored Medici government. He was arrested, imprisoned, and subjected to a brutal form of torture called strappado. In this torture, a prisoner's hands are bound behind their back. Then they are hoisted into the air by a rope. Their own body weight pulls violently against their shoulders, often dislocating them. Machiavelli endured this torture, and he steadfastly denied any involvement in the conspiracy. Remarkably, he was eventually released, but he was exiled from Florence and confined to a small family farm in the countryside. Cut off entirely from the political world that had defined his adult life. Imagine spending 14 years at the center of European power, meeting kings, popes, and warlords, shaping the strategy of an entire republic, only to suddenly find yourself alone on a small farm, financially ruined, physically broken, and completely irrelevant to the world you once helped run. Most men in that position would have quietly faded away. Machiavelli, instead, picked up a pen. In the evenings, after spending his days managing the mundane tasks of farm life, Machiavelli would retreat to his study. He would put on the formal robes he once wore as a government official. Then he would write. Privately, he described this as entering intellectual conversations with the great political minds of ancient history. Out of this strange, isolated ritual came his most famous and most controversial work, a short political treatise called The Prince. It was written around 1513, though it was not published until years after his death. On the surface, Machiavelli intended it as an instruction manual for rulers. More specifically, it was an attempt to win back favor with the Medici family. He wanted to demonstrate his deep understanding of how power actually functioned. But what he produced was far more radical than a simple career move. The Prince became one of the most shocking and influential political documents in Western history, because it refused to pretend that politics was governed by conventional morality, or that politics should be governed by conventional morality. Before Machiavelli, most political writing operated under a comfortable assumption. A good ruler was, by definition, a morally good person, someone honest, merciful, generous, and pious. The assumption was that these virtues would naturally lead to successful, stable rule. Machiavelli looked at centuries of actual history, and he concluded that this assumption was not just naive, it was dangerously wrong. He argued that a ruler who insisted on always being honest would often be exploited. A ruler who insisted on always being merciful would often be betrayed. And a ruler who insisted on always being generous could eventually destroy himself, because more ruthless rivals would feel no such constraints. This led to his most famous idea, the idea that it is safer for a ruler to be feared than loved, if he cannot manage to be both at the same time. His reasoning was coldly practical, not cruel for its own sake. Love, he argued, is maintained by the goodwill of the people, and goodwill is fragile, fickle, and easily disappears the moment it becomes inconvenient. Fear, however, is maintained by the ruler himself, through consistent, credible consequences. That makes fear a far more reliable foundation for control. But this was not Machiavelli endorsing cruelty for pleasure. He explicitly warned rulers against needless cruelty. A wise ruler uses fear strategically and sparingly, precisely calibrated to maintain order. Not randomly, not excessively. Because excessive cruelty breeds hatred, and hatred eventually becomes rebellion. This is where Machiavelli's ideas stop being simply political philosophy and start becoming the economics of power. At its core, The Prince is really a book about resource allocation under scarcity, competition, and constant threat. Only instead of capital, the scarce resource is political authority. Machiavelli understood that a ruler's power is like a company's market position. It is not something you can simply declare into existence. It has to be built, defended, and reinforced through calculated decisions. And it is always under threat from competitors. Competitors who would happily seize it the moment you show weakness. He argued that a wise ruler should avoid depending on mercenary armies, or borrowed military strength. Hired soldiers have no true loyalty. They will abandon you the moment a better offer appears. Instead, a ruler should build his own reliable, disciplined forces. That idea maps almost perfectly onto modern business strategy. Build in-house capabilities. Do not depend entirely on outside contractors or unreliable partners. Machiavelli also argued that a wise ruler should study history obsessively, not as a collection of interesting stories, but as a data set full of patterns, mistakes, and repeated human behavior. That approach feels remarkably similar to modern hedge fund analysts studying decades of market cycles. They study the past to predict future behavior. Machiavelli was, in essence, one of the earliest thinkers to treat power itself as a strategic resource, a resource governed by identifiable, learnable rules, not something granted by divine right, not something controlled purely by luck. That single intellectual shift changed everything. He treated power as a system, not as a mystery, and that is precisely why his ideas eventually escaped politics. They quietly infiltrated business, finance, and corporate strategy. Perhaps Machiavelli's most enduring practical insight involves the timing of harm and the timing of reward. This idea still shapes modern turnaround strategy, corporate restructuring, and political campaign management. He argued that if a ruler must inflict pain, it should be done swiftly, decisively, and all at once. Layoffs, punishments, unpopular decisions. The pain should not be dragged out endlessly, because people can absorb a single sharp shock and eventually move on. Benefits and rewards, however, should be distributed slowly, gradually, over time. That allows people to savor them and appreciate them for much longer. Every fresh installment reinforces loyalty and gratitude. Think about how strikingly modern this advice actually is. Corporate consultants today often advise companies to announce painful cost-cutting measures in one decisive action, rather than dragging them out for months, because gradual, repeated pain creates more anger, more anxiety, and more resentment. Meanwhile, companies often roll out employee benefits, raises, and perks gradually, not all at once, because gradual rewards can maximize sustained goodwill and long-term loyalty. Machiavelli identified this exact psychological principle roughly 500 years ago. Timing dramatically shapes how humans perceive suffering. And generosity. Centuries before, behavioral economists would give it a formal academic name. Machiavelli's influence did not end with the prince, and it certainly did not end with his death in 1527. His ideas quietly seeped into the thinking of history's most consequential figures, whether or not they publicly admitted it. Rulers and statesmen across later centuries studied Machiavelli closely. Powerful European monarchs, political strategists, and American founding fathers debating the limits of government power. They extracted practical lessons from his writing, lessons about how institutions actually maintain authority and stability, even while publicly distancing themselves from his reputation for ruthlessness. In the modern era, his fingerprints are everywhere. Once you know how to look for them, political campaign strategists use his logic when framing an opponent's weaknesses. Corporate executives use it when deciding how and when to announce difficult organizational changes. Negotiation experts use it when teaching the strategic value of appearing unpredictable. Business school students still study principles that echo his thinking. All of them are drawing from the same old playbook, whether they realize it or not, a 500-year-old playbook, written by an exiled, tortured Florentine bureaucrat on a quiet countryside farm. Consider how directly Machiavellian thinking maps onto the modern corporate world. His argument was simple. Rulers must be adaptable. They should be virtuous when virtue serves them, but ruthless when circumstances demand it. They should not remain rigidly committed to one fixed moral approach. That mirrors almost exactly how modern competitive strategy works in practice. Successful companies today are routinely praised for being agile. They adjust their public image, their pricing strategy, and even their stated values. Depending on rapidly shifting market conditions and competitive pressure, that is the same calculated flexibility Machiavelli advocated centuries earlier. Only now, it applies to boardrooms instead of royal courts. His warning about powerful nobles also feels strikingly modern. A ruler who depends entirely on their goodwill is inherently unstable, because those same nobles can withdraw support the instant it becomes inconvenient. That logic echoes through modern corporate governance, especially when companies depend too heavily on a small handful of powerful shareholders, board members, or activist investors, people who can turn against leadership the moment their own interests shift. Even his infamous argument about appearances still applies today. Machiavelli argued that a ruler must be seen as virtuous, generous, and trustworthy, even while making far more calculated decisions behind closed doors. That describes almost uncomfortably well how modern corporate public relations often function. Reputation management is not always about revealing truth. Sometimes it is about controlling perception. Now let's talk honestly about the practical lessons in power and strategy. For a moment, separate them from moral judgment. The first lesson is that stability requires active maintenance, not passive assumption. Machiavelli repeatedly emphasized that power is never permanently secure. Once acquired, it must be constantly reinforced. Through calculated decisions, vigilance, and adaptation, that principle applies directly to maintaining market share in a competitive industry, just as it applies to maintaining a political throne. The second lesson is that perception and reality can diverge strategically. A leader's public image does not need to perfectly match their private calculations. The ability to project one thing while executing another can become a real source of power, especially when done skillfully, and for legitimate strategic reasons. The third lesson is that timing transforms the emotional impact of every decision. The exact same action can create very different reactions, delivering bad news, taking away a benefit, punishing a mistake. Each one can generate resentment or acceptance depending on how and when it is delivered. The fourth lesson is perhaps his most misunderstood idea. Effectiveness and morality are separate questions, and they deserve separate analysis. Machiavelli was not arguing that cruelty is good. He was arguing that a leader must understand reality clearly. A leader who refuses to even consider ruthless options may create greater harm in the long run, especially when circumstances genuinely demand hard choices, because losing power entirely can hand control to someone with far fewer scruples. Of course, no honest examination of Machiavelli's legacy can ignore its darker dimensions. The prince has been used for 5 centuries to justify horrifying behavior. Dictators and authoritarian rulers have selectively quoted Machiavelli. They used him to rationalize brutal crackdowns, political assassinations, and the systematic elimination of rivals. Conveniently, they ignored his warnings against excessive cruelty. They ignored his concern for long-term stability and focused only on the parts that served their violence. The word Machiavellian became a synonym for cold, manipulative, amoral scheming. Almost immediately after his death, for centuries his name was associated with villainy, deception, and ruthless power pursued for its own sake. Much of the nuance of his actual historical context was stripped away, but there is a significant historical irony here. During his real career, Machiavelli was known as a loyal public servant, a dedicated diplomat, and administrator of the Florentine Republic. Many historians now argue that The Prince may be more complicated than it appears. Some believe it may have been partly written as dark satire, or as a cautionary warning about unchecked absolute rulers, rather than a sincere endorsement of tyranny. That scholarly debate continues to this very day. The man who gave the world a word for calculated ruthlessness may have been far more complicated, and possibly even more idealistic, than his terrifying reputation has ever allowed him to be. So why does a 500-year-old political treatise still matter today? A book written by an obscure, tortured, exiled Florentine bureaucrat. Why does it still echo in boardrooms, campaign offices, and negotiating tables? Because Machiavelli stripped away comforting illusions about power. He examined it as a cold, functional system, a system governed by human psychology, incentives, and competition. Those patterns remain essentially unchanged across centuries, whether you are a Renaissance prince defending a small Italian city-state, or a modern chief executive defending market share against aggressive competitors. Every time a political consultant advises a candidate to appear strong, Machiavelli's shadow is there. Every time a corporate team debates whether to announce layoffs all at once or gradually, his logic appears again. Every time a negotiator calculates how much to reveal and how much to conceal, the same playbook returns. They may have never read a single page of his writing, but they are still engaging with his ideas. Ideas first articulated in explicit, unflinching detail centuries ago, from a lonely farmhouse outside Florence, by a man stripped of the very power he had spent his life studying. And perhaps that is the most haunting lesson buried inside this story. The man who taught the world how power works spent his final productive years with none of it, tortured, exiled, and financially ruined. He wrote brilliant political analysis from complete irrelevance, for Medici rulers who largely ignored him during his own lifetime. Machiavelli died in 1527. He never saw The Prince published. He never knew his name would become one of the most feared words in the English language. And he never regained the political influence he had spent his adult life building, the influence he lost in a single catastrophic moment. Power, it turns out, does not always reward those who understand it best. Sometimes it discards the very people who understand it most clearly, leaving them to watch from the outside. As lesser minds, repeat the exact mistakes they warned against. So, the next time you notice a political strategist calculating public perception, remember Machiavelli. The next time a corporate leader carefully times a difficult announcement, remember him again. The next time a negotiator reveals only what serves them, ask yourself one question. How much of the modern world's machinery of power was quietly designed 500 years ago? By a broken man on a small farm, a man who had lost everything, except the one thing that actually mattered. He understood, better than almost anyone in history, exactly how the game was truly played. If this story changed the way you think about power, strategy, and the hidden rules running the world, subscribe to Economy Rewind History. Because the sharpest minds in history are rarely the ones who win. They are simply the ones who leave behind the instructions for everyone who comes after them.